Welcome back, everyone. I'm Bailey.
And I'm Raquel.
And this is the Whole Shebang podcast.
On today's episode, we watched Ancient Aliens, Episode 3, Season 6, The Anunnaki Connection. We're going to be talking about our reactions and the actual facts. And here with me today is Ricky, our resident archaeologist.
So I am currently a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and I specialize in Mesopotamia. Archaeology, texts, art, literature, languages. So many languages.
And how many languages do you speak again?
Modern or ancient?
Both.
Including English or excluding English?
English is a given.
8. But multiple dialects and multiple languages.
Okay. So yeah, join us as we dive into this episode, because this one, the Anunnaki Connection, actually,
She has it written down, has to go double check.
the Anunnaki Connection deals with ancient Mesopotamia, which is your field of expertise.
And even more so, it talks about Mesopotamian religion, which is what I'm writing my dissertation on.
So we figured we'd watch it and break it down. We wrote,
No.
you wrote 6 pages, I wrote 3.
8 with pictures.
I didn't go that in depth.
I did research. You're welcome.
So why don't you start off?
I think you
Because I'm
start
layman.
off. You can ask questions and I can later go through my notes and figure out what we haven't talked about.
So the Anunnaki was ancient people, or gods, so to say, and they base this episode loosely or around Zachariah Stitchin's books.
Which are a fun read.
They are a fun read, very religious. I listened to a couple of them and they break down the religious sides of things, and it was quite hard to get through. Interesting concepts. I did actually purchase, and I own one of his books, bought it years ago, called DNA of the Gods. And we'll kind of get into that, but it was basically the Anunnaki genetically engineered humans to come down to Earth and mine for them. So we were like their slaves. That's kind of the premise around this and where it's all going. But we'll get into this. Okay, so this episode...
It's a really good thing they can't see my face yet. I know I'm making some good ones.
Yeah, you're making some really good faces. Obviously, you believe in none of this, which I will also say, don't believe in any of this. It's really far-fetched.
Do your research.
Do a lot of research. We'll actually talk about a couple of the researchers today and what they actually specialized in. Spoiler, it was not ancient Mesopotamia.
Of course not.
Why would they have actual archaeologists that study the subject on their TV show? No clue.
On the History Channel.
The fact that it's on the History Channel kind of blows me away. I think people are going for the mystery, and it is supposed to be entertainment. Let's highlight and underline that word, entertainment, which usually is not based in facts, because facts can be pretty boring.
Yeah, and in our next podcast episode, we're going to talk about one of the more recent from, I believe it's season 20, which is on a similar topic, and the clips I saw were very similar to this episode, so we're going to watch it and see how similar and how much of this stuff they're reusing, and if they put anything new in it, which will be kind of fun.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. So, as we started watching this episode, one of my first notes...
We should probably mention we watched it separately.
Mainly because I wanted to bring these topics together. And I know that if we had just watched it together, we probably would have done the whole podcast and then had to reiterate and lost some of the good conversation points that I'm sure we're going to have.
And we hear your feedback on the Ancient Apocalypse episode. We're fixing it.
We're fixing it. We got some stuff. We're doing some stuff. And we are planning reactions.
So you can watch it with us.
Exactly. And hopefully we will not give away the entire podcast. But you know what? That's what the YouTube's for.
Yep.
So, okay, one of the main things, they start off talking about Israel and the war with the United States in 2003 and the ransacking of the museums and how there were people going in ransacking that had headpieces like they were a part of the military. So first note I have was why the military would be going in and destroying these artifacts. And they're kind of portraying it in a way like they didn't want these secrets to get out. And I personally think that's false. I think that the museums were ransacked. I'm not familiar with Iraq and the war, but I don't think that there were people going in and destroying it because it held some untold secrets from this ancient civilization. So that was my first point that I wrote down, because I do not believe that the military was going in there. I do believe that there was obviously people going in destroying works, getting them to resell them. Like that happens today in a lot of museums. But point on point, I don't think the military was going in there to prevent this information from leaking out because it would rewrite history. Okay, what are your thoughts on that, though? You were giving me some looks.
I am giving you some looks. So I put showing modern things to make it relevant, which is a great way to put your research out there. It's something I'm terrible at, but a lot of people are experts, and this show is no different. The Iraq unrest and mentioning the looting of artifacts, stolen objects from the museum, emphasis on the tablets that were stolen, which is used by ancient aliens to create an air of mystery. So why are people destroying objects from the past? Their answer in the show is that they are trying to hide the secret. So Bailey just told us, according to archaeologists, most artifacts are from the Sumerian time period, and that's going to be one of my biggest complaints as we go along, and I'm not going to dwell on it now. So my points here, that no, they're not all from the Sumerian time period. Most of them, in fact, are not. There are very few artifacts left in the world from the Sumerian time period because we haven't excavated a ton of places that go down that deep. So most of the objects that are actually Sumerian are probably in the British Museum. So that's point one. Point two, if you think about how ISIS destroyed certain landmarks, say the Palace of Nineveh, ISIS's motives for destroying cultural heritage, they claim, is to remove images of other gods because there's only one true God. But there's another aspect. Apart from beheading people at these sites and mass graves and all these horrible things that are also going on with the human interaction, when heritage is destroyed, it gets a lot of attention.
Yeah, that's true.
Destroying these cultural sites is their means for gaining a global audience. Which is sad that we are more concerned about the heritage sites than the people. And there's a lot of really interesting research done and discussions from other archaeologists who talk about this. We should acknowledge the loss of human life as the most tragic event that happened, not the destroying of the cultural sites. All of these cultural sites are well documented. We have pictures, we have measurements. We can recreate them if we absolutely have to. The fact that human lives were taken is much more serious. But this is an issue. And it gains global attention when you start bombing these ancient sites. So that's why they pick these predominantly, but also it's to deface the figures and try to remove themselves from their ancestors. In this area of the Near East, there's a disconnect between the ancient people and modern people. They're not the same. Why they are stolen from museums is a whole other story. And I'm part of a lab that works on looted heritage, so we talk about this a lot. Valuable pieces. So we start thinking about the illegal art market, why objects are stolen, why you hire guards, why if you have gold, the police are usually on site as well. It still happens. The looting of archaeological sites is very, very common, unfortunately, and especially in places like Iraq and Syria. You have these war-torn places and people who need money. If you know that fancy white archaeologists are digging over there and they're paying a lot of money and suddenly they leave and there's no guards, there's probably something you could find. Whether it be gold or tablets, these things sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars online. And it's really, really horrible because it takes it out of the archaeological context, which is something we don't think about a lot in, say, places like Britain when you use your metal finder to find coins and things. But that's also the same idea, is you are taking it from its context, and now it changes the meaning. If I have a tablet about, say, the flood myth, because we really like the flood myth, if you find the flood myth in a temple versus a school, there's going to be different context. Is it a religious text if it's found in a school and there are copies, or is it a made-up story? Versus if it's in a temple, maybe it has a little bit more religious context. There's a reason that temple is an institution is collecting it. So these things change how we view stuff. And obviously, clay tablets are the size of your hand. They're very easy to smuggle, which is really unfortunate. And that's how a lot of museum collections, even today, collect objects. And there was over 10,000 objects taken from the Iraq Museum that were returned. A lot of them made their way to the US. They entered into these art markets. The actual good auction houses flagged them right away and said, this is from the museum. There's a record. Let's return it. But it was a huge deal. It still is. There's still a lot of things that have not made it back.
That's very interesting.
We can do a whole podcast on looting.
Here's my question. Have you ever looked on eBay?
Oh, yeah.
Have you found anything on eBay?
Not really. Well, doing research for my dissertation, I've ended up on a lot of art auction houses, particularly in Britain and France. They're there. Whether taken recently, mostly not so much. A lot of it comes from if you found it in your grandma's house. Now you're going to sell it, and your grandma would have had it legally because it wasn't illegal back then, so you could still sell it now.
Interesting.
And there's a lot of really weird laws about this. I think there's a cutoff date for how legal it is, and area-wise as well. And I just actually did a project for a library, which I don't know if I can talk about quite yet, about finding provenance for a tablet. And I'm happy to share that once the exhibition is out in the fall.
That would be a great follow-up podcast.
And we can talk about the methodology I went through to find the information about the tablet.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Maybe we'll get something new.
But that was just my first point.
That's what's going on with the museum situation.
So I have a couple other questions. Was Sumeria the first civilization? We touched on what civilizations were in our last one where we watched Ancient Apocalypse and what classifies as a civilization. So under those contexts, was Sumeria one of the first civilizations?
This is really hard because the deciding factor is writing. Was Sumer the first place that we have evidence where there's writing? Yes. So then yes.
Okay.
If you're following that criteria. Is it likely China had writing beforehand? They're very close. Okay. Egypt too, very close. We're talking 50 to 100 years off. Very close in the timeline. If you exclude writing, then I would say probably not. Because you can probably count Neanderthals as a civilization then.
Okay.
And that excludes writing and monolithic structures. But we know even today there are still peoples who are not. They're still hunter-gatherers. They're wanderers. They're people who move around. They live in tents. Do we count them as a civilization? Well, now we do. So that whole idea of what a civilization is really foggy. But in our fancy white armchairs that we're sitting here, I would say yes.
Okay, so that was one of the facts they got right in the show.
Yeah.
They touched on it and then left it. I was curious. The ziggurat of Ur.
Yep.
So, it just showed pictures of the ziggurat of Ur, and they were all excited because they found it, but didn't really explain what it was.
What you're seeing in images and what they're showing on screen, there's a few that popped up that I was like, absolutely no, is a reconstruction. So after they excavated the ziggurat at Ur, they rebuilt it. So it's kind of misleading when you see it because it looks very complete. It was a mound. Secondly, that ziggurat is from the first millennium BCE, and we're talking the Sumerians in the third millennium BCE. So that's 2,000 years difference. Most of the things you see on the screen are from the first millennium when they're talking about the Sumerian civilization, which is 2,000 years earlier. Huge problem there. Different cultures, different way of life.
Even if you consider how we as a civilization have advanced from the 1900s to today.
That would be like saying that smartphones are showing what technology looked like in the Victorian era.
Which is insane. The discrepancy in the pictures is
a big thing. Some temples at Eridu are rebuilt. We have previous layers. And the kings talk about rebuilding temples. One of their main tasks is to rebuild and make the temples better. So the ziggurat is a huge step, like pyramid that goes up, and at the top you have a temple. That's all it is. So you've seen the pictures. If you don't know what it looks like, Google it. You'll see a lot of it. Temple on the top, and then a bunch of gates around it. So the interesting thing about the ziggurat is that they are actually able to excavate around it, and they found the whole structure, including where the nun-like women would live. They have the priests' houses. There's other temple structures around there. There's a gate around there. And then kind of towards that structure is the Royal Cemetery of Ur, which is why they're talking about the ziggurat, is because it's connected to the cemetery, except not really.
okay.
So it's meant to look like a mountain.
Good information. They didn't go into the ziggurat or why exactly it was important.
They were just showing it as a pretense for the site.
Fantastic. Okay, my next question. I do take these shows. I love these shows. I watch them quite a bit. But I do take them with a grain of salt because, as you're finding out, there is a lot of discrepancies in what they're telling you and only tiny smidges of actual information. So my next one that I wanted to check with you, were the Anunnaki mentioned on cuneiform tablets that you know of?
Yes,
They are.
they are.
So the Anunnaki were actually the gods that they worship.
Yes and no. This is what I wanted to talk about. Anunnaki is not a Sumerian term. That is an Akkadian word, not a Sumerian one. The Sumerian culture they're talking about is the 3rd millennium. These are small city-states like Uruk, Sippar, Nippur. All these, they're in southern Mesopotamia, which is southern Iraq, and they're right on the coast. The Akkadian Empire comes in the late 3rd millennium from Akkad, and it becomes bigger and they expand their empire. They kind of briefly talk on this history in the episode. And then they're replaced by almost a Neo-Sumerian empire, so the city-states start to gain power again this last couple hundred years. And then Hammurabi of Babylon comes in and he takes over, and Babylon becomes main power. And then Babylon falls, and you have the Sealand dynasty and the Kassites. And then Assyria comes in, and Assyria takes over. And then Assyria falls, and then Babylon takes over again, and then you have the Persians. Very, very brief history of Mesopotamia in a minute. So you have the Sumerians, and they invent things like writing and the wheel and math. They invented math. So very exciting. And then when Akkad takes over, they assimilate into that culture. So then when the Akkadian Empire falls, they try to regain what they had. At this point, they're probably not speaking Sumerian anymore. They try to rebring back Sumerian. The King Shulgi, he really pushes to be like, this is who we are. We should be like this and stop trying to be like them. That all collapses. And then Sumerian and the Sumerian culture kind of becomes a fascination thing. It's like if you were in modern Italy thinking about your Roman ancestors. They are similar, and a lot of things are borrowed. A lot of things are mixed, but they are different. And there's a lot of different people coming in and different ideas coming in. Eventually, some people are probably still native Sumerians, but distantly. You're talking thousands of years, and people move. I had a professor really stress this idea that people do move. Why do we think of ancient people living in their one little hovel forever? That's not the reality of it. We see expansions in big cities fall apart, and then people go back into the countryside, and we know they're trading all over the Middle East, into Italy, Spain even eventually. So, this whole expansion, possibly even all the way to India already in the 2nd millennium, they're not stagnant. So it kind of gets a little mixed, but they would claim themselves as the ancestors of the Sumerians.
Okay.
So back to the Anunnaki. This term isn't attested in the Akkadian period yet. So the first attestation is that Neo-Sumerian that I just talked about, which is the fall of the Akkadian Empire. And Anunnaki is an Akkadian word. There is a term in Sumerian that comes up from text from this post-Akkadian period. So we're talking early second millennium. Again, 1,000 years from the time that they're discussing. So the word in Sumerian is Anuna, close to Anunnaki. So the way that Anunnaki is written in the cuneiform is, in the Sumerian, it's written with a divine determinative and nun, na, ki, and ni. The ki and ni are suffixes, not part of the word. So this is most likely an iteration on ki, which is a genitive marker, and inen, the plural. So what happens is when they're trying to revitalize this Sumerian, they misinterpret it. And even later on, when they start to look at it, they say, oh, this is the word, this is what it must have been in Sumerian. So we're talking after this Neo-Sumerian period, we forget the language pretty much, and we're just reading it off the tablets. It's like Latin. Yeah. So then they're misinterpreting it and then putting it into Akkadian in a different way. And this happens with my own dissertation figure as well, which is kind of an interesting process, but I think it's actually the other way around. They're putting it wrong in Sumerian, in that one. So they're trying to keep this idea that the Sumerians have come up with, but the word is completely all over the place. It's a misread in Akkadian.
Yeah.
As for a translation, no one can agree. I did some research on this. The best one, eventually I'll share all these with you. There's this beautiful, it's the Aurak from the Penn Museum. They do a lot of really awesome databases of cuneiform archives. So this is the god list, and I looked up the Anunnaki, the group of gods, and it gives a lot of resources on people who have tried to write about them. There's no conclusion on what the terminology in the word actually means. There's some different interpretations. It's probably like the seed or something like that, something to do with seeds or power in text. So if I look at the text, which I pulled up here, well, these are the Akkadian ones I'm showing Bailey right now. These are all Neo-Sumerian texts. There's a lot of references. In every single one, the word is used to define a class of deities titled Naki or Anuna. It'll be like Enki, the god, who is the greatest of the Anunnaki. Or the Anunnaki sat in judgment. Usually they're invoked as protection. And this class is understood. We have multiple layers of deities in Mesopotamia. Anunnaki would be your higher class gods.
Okay, so in layman's terms, to translate what you've just told me, it's kind of like Zeus on Mount Olympus. They are the higher gods, but there were many other minor gods that you don't really see in Olympus.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the Anunnaki would contribute or be a part of the higher
Yeah, so if you,
gods.
It's, religion reflects what you see in real life. So the Anunnaki are like your kings and your elite people. The lower gods would be counted as your predominantly male citizens, people who belonged. And then you have the foreigners, your slaves, your servants, that group at the bottom. Mesopotamia is big on social hierarchy, different periods, but hierarchy is very important. Same within the gods. My dissertation figure, which Bailey has heard too much about, is a very, very minor deity who's part of the class of demons and protective spirits. He's at the bottom. Almost a slave. The Anunnaki, the gods who are part of the Anunnaki, are the most predominant gods in Mesopotamia. They're the ones who have cities dedicated to them. So, like, for example, Enki, who comes up in the show a little bit, or Ea in Akkadian, his seat is the city Eridu. He lives in Eridu. His main temple is Eridu. He's the patron god of that city. In Babylon, their patron god is Marduk. So Marduk rules there. It's also a way for them to structure, like, who's the better city or like who's in power when. And these stories we read about the gods are really reflections of, oh, they talk about Enuma Elish in the show. That's pretty much the whole story of Enuma Elish, is heightening Marduk and showing his rise to power over these other gods who all at one point their cities had kingship, and now it's explaining why Babylon has kingship. So it's very, you need to know about the history to understand what they're talking about.
And they don't actually go into much history before they start talking about it.
No, not at all. Okay, sorry, ramble about the Anunnaki.
That's okay. That was good. That answered my question. You sent me a text to ask if I found anything believable, compelling facts that I found believable. Most of the facts and the way they're speaking about them, they talk with a lot of confidence. It makes it more believable just from the way they're talking. I could say I didn't really believe much. It's probably because I went into this looking for things, right? But if I were to just sit down and watch it, like I did a lot when I was a kid, I remember sitting there and it was one of my favorite shows. I just believed everything they said because they just talked about it with such confidence, and it seemed like they were doing so much research and everything else. And I'm a conspiracy theorist. I'll give myself that. I believe in a lot of conspiracy theories. But again, with a grain of salt, because I'm not going to be the one going out there and proving them. It's all going to be other people, so it's all going to be hearsay. But the facts do present as facts, even though, like Ricky was saying, they're not, or they're off by thousands of years. I remember the facts being believable when I was younger because I went into it looking for flaws. I was seeing it everywhere.
Yeah.
But for an average person who's just sitting down to watch it, I could see how the show is very believable and how it would compel people to believe in what they're talking about. When they point out the ancient astronaut theorists, want to highlight the line theorists. Theory needs information and proof. It also needs to be tested. And there is not really anything to back it up cohesively or for them to test. Like when they talk about, oh, they came down and maybe they went back up in spaceships and that's how they got like away from the floods. There's got to be something. There would be something.
They really threw spaceships in there. I was like, okay, sure. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, they went off in spaceships. I'm like, okay, that's where you're losing me.
The images they showed of the spaceships were these big honks of like spaceships. If anything like that happens, there would have been proof, because there's no way just a few people would have seen these spaceships. They would have written about them. It would have been the thing that they talked about for centuries. There was a point in the show showing a relief, and he had something that looked like a watch. But the relief also showed a flower in the watch type thing. And from my understanding of ancient cultures, which is slim to none, even in the Victoria period, people wore flowers to hide their smell. They weren't the cleanliest, like anything like that. It could have been. It wasn't a watch. You didn't see numbers. You didn't see dials. It was a thing that they wore around their wrist, which is an accessory, which was popular in all cultures.
Fun fact, we have those from archaeological evidence.
Do you?
Yes, and they are just flower pictured.
Cool. I'm an archaeologist now. And then I wrote another thing down. I'm just saying my points and they're butting them at this point.
No, we'll go through my points after.
We'll go through your points. Okay. And then they start talking about genetic engineering by gods. Definitely sounds false. Genetic engineering for us today is extremely difficult. With all our advancements, if I was looking at this, maybe they genetically altered us or created us as humans to be their slaves and mine for gold, which was what they had. We would see some signs with our genetic DNA, anything. We would see a point where we were genetically altered, genetically made. We would be able to reproduce humans if we could decode the code. So definitely false. I don't think we were genetically engineered, except for I don't know, would you call it natural genetic engineering, how we evolved from what we are?
Yeah.
But in the way they're talking about, no. That's what I have to say about that. Just no. This is another thing I touched on. References abnormally long lives. These gods are people living for 900 years, 1,000 years, and go on and so forth. In the Bible, it also does reference of abnormally long not lives, right? Like 200 years, 300 years, so on and so forth. So my question to you, is it because they had a different method of recording time?
It's an interesting thought.
Because I know that the time we go by for our months and stuff like that, the Roman calendar was adopted around 5th century BC, where we started to record time differently. I do believe before that, we went by lunar phases of the moon.
Yeah.
So, whether that's right or not, archaeologists, come for me in the comments. But I don't know, was it just a way that they referenced their time that made it seem longer?
I wish that was the case.
Because usually they lived shorter lives.
Yeah, debatable.
But would they be living into their 80s, 90s? Like now?
There are several people from the ancient world who lived to 100.
And we are seeing it today.
Whether that's an exaggeration, we don't know. The reason why we talk about people dying young is because the infant mortality rate is incredibly low. So your chance of living past the age of 2 is very slim. 25% of kids would have died.
There.
So that brings down your mortality rate. But the idea of having people, even in the medieval ages, like, they were elderly people. We know there's elderly people. They talk about elderly people, maybe not into their 80s. I think 60 is a good age to think about. Especially the later you get into the first millennium, women died in childbirth a lot. So that adds to your mortality rate. If you're not a woman or a child and you make it past 10 as a male, you're probably going to be in your 40s, 50s. Sometimes they didn't get married until past their teens. Like, we always talk about, oh, they got married so young, but they didn't, not really. As for what we're talking about with these ages, I have it here, the Sumerian king list that they're talking about in the episode. And it does start, like, if we look at the very first king, he ruled for 288,000 years.
They lived as long as Earth was created.
But then if we go down and we start getting the mix of kings from different places ruling, we have 30 years, 15 years, 4 years, 43 years. It was much more reasonable.
Much more reasonable and believable.
One thing about the Sumerian king list is it was written about 1,000 years after this time is talking about. Like telephone. Obviously, they had some documents. There's a lot of different lists. There's various lists. This is how we've reconstructed king reigns and how we've reconstructed their time periods. But they change. But to talk about these ridiculously long years, these ones even longer than the ones in the Bible, a lot of these very, very extravagant ones are before the flood. But then even after the flood, we still have people living for 900, 2,000 years. It's because they don't know. It sounds a lot more impressive if you're like, my first king reigned for 200,000 years, opposed to 2 years. And then we also need to think about the purpose of these lists. Why does somebody write a king list? What is its purpose? One is that you're trying to legitimatize your own rule. So if you're throwing facts and you're like, look at all this archaeological evidence and these inscriptions from these kings, we can match how long they've reigned. But if we want to prove we've been here forever, we're going to make up some kings and maybe a couple gods and famous kings like Gilgamesh, give them outrageously long lifespans. We have attestations of a lot of them. This is fact, but not all fact. They exclude kings we know about. They don't mention all of them. The king list also tells us which cities was reigning for which periods. And in especially the Sumerian culture, they believe your time will come. There will be an end. And then the cycle will get renewed, but it'll be at a different place. So they were perfectly okay with, okay, now Agaday is fallen, the Akkadian Empire is gone. Now we're moving into another city in power. That's normal. So for them, this is their way of showing this city had kingship then, but then it became this city, and now it's this city, and these are all the kings that reigned. It's fascinating that they pointed this out. I think it's to show, look, everybody lived for a long time, so they must be hybrids.
Yeah, hybrids or even the gods themselves.
In terms of archaeological evidence, we can see that we have their bones. You can tell when someone is in their 30s and they've died versus when they're 100. I did want to share a fun fact, though, which is why I ended up going through all of my old readings and stuff. So in the Chronicles of Early Kings, which is on a similar note to the Sumerian king list, it does actually mention a gardener who was named king after the king died. So in Mesopotamia, there's a substitute king ritual. If I have a bad omen saying that the king is going to die, he can hire someone to be the king and die for him. So this poor gardener man is chosen to die for the king, and he is declared the king, and so he gets crowned, because then technically he's the king, so he's going to be the one the omen is talking about now instead of the other guy, and he's going to die in place, right? Usually they would just kill him to get it over with, and that gets rid of the bad omens. But in this case, before they could do that, the guy who was the king died sipping his hot soup. And so the gardener suddenly became the king, and that is how his dynasty started.
That's kind of hilarious.
Isn't it great? Why wouldn't you talk about that?
Like, this guy is now appointed king, and he's like, great, this is not how I expected my Friday to go. And at his coronation or whatever, the old king sips his soup and dies, and he's like, shit.
And they were like, well, I guess you're the king now. I guess the other guy didn't have any heirs or something, or who knows, but now you're king.
Best rag to riches story I have ever heard.
I think it's pretty great.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing fact.
Whether that actually happened, we don't know. A lot of the times, these kings who usurp come from humble backgrounds. So Sargon the Great, he was a cupbearer. We know that he took power, but they always come from this humble beginning. Same like the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. They were, abandoned from their priestess mother. Think about Moses. Humble backgrounds. So it's a genre that comes up a lot.
I will not believe that until my death.
There you go. How to become king.
How to become king. 2 steps. Oh, he probably planned it himself, growing the food for the king.
Yeah, I don't know what he put in that hot soup, but...
That's a fun story.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. So, as we move on, this is when they start to mention Zachariah Sitchin?
Sitchin?
Sitchin. So, who was he, really? He was a journalism and editor, and he got a degree in economic history.
Yep.
That was it. He didn't study ancient Mesopotamia, and they say, he read cuneiform tablets for over 30 years, and he was an expert. No, that would be the same as me looking at a cuneiform tablet and being like, you know what? I'm just going to read the same thing for 30 years. And I'm going to tell you what it says. I would have no education in it.
Did you also notice whenever they talk about his theories or his ideas and they say he translated these tablets, they never actually mention which tablets?
Oh, you see, I didn't notice that. But to me, I'm like, well, if you never went to get education on how to read the tablets, how are you translating the tablets?
You can learn. It takes a lot of work, but people can teach themselves.
The fact that he had written so many books, to me, that seemed more of a gimmick. I've read these tablets.
Oh, yeah.
These tablets support what I'm writing. So read what I'm writing.
Here, I even timestamped it. 4120. According to Sitchin's interpretations of Sumerian texts, blah, blah, blah. My comment, what text?
Tell us the text you studied. Well, they also showed reliefs of cuneiform, and they're like, there's over 200 tablets around here, and this must have been important on these great big reliefs that they had.
Which are also Assyrian from the first millennium.
Cool. So that's not even from the millennium they're talking about.
Yep. 2,000 years later.
Their budget for the History Channel must be sky high.
Oh, yeah.
If they're like just jumping around, they can afford thousands of years worth of material scattered all throughout. What text? Text from all over. Text from thousands of years.
Well,
that they're just
my big issue is that when they are talking about tablets and things and they're giving their evidence, they say Enuma Elish, the King List, the Book of Enoch. They're titling their texts. They're telling us where they're getting their evidence from. And as soon as they start talking about Sitchin, it's just his Sumerian text. Why all of a sudden are we just not talking about which text?
that too. So then, of course, after we talk about Sitchin, whichever he is, I'm going to mess that name up. We start talking about Nibiru, which, if you haven't heard, there's been doomsday prophecies about Nibiru from him for a long time. Nibiru, even today, is prevalent in any doomsday theories. I constantly see headlines popping up on my TikTok and stuff about Nibiru coming and we're all going to die. And I'm just sitting here waiting. So the reason he was saying that the Anunnaki came to Earth and genetically engineered these humans was to mine for gold, to patch the atmospheric holes around Nibiru because the gods couldn't live there anymore. And so that's the comment that made me go, what the fuck?
I want to know where he's getting that from.
Hey, we have a hole in our ozone. I mean, if we could get gold to patch that, that would be great. But did we give it all to the Anunnaki?
But why gold?
Exactly. Why gold? You'd think if they're such an advanced civilization, they're going to be wanting something other than a basic mineral that's found. And so I did a little research on my own about Nibiru. Because I was like, is Nibiru an actual planet? No. It's not. But what it could be, which makes way more sense, is the pole star or Ursa Minor, which they could be referencing. Because as we know, a lot of ancient peoples looked to the stars.
Oh, astrology was huge in Mesopotamia. I kind of avoid it because it's very technical and very mathy. But I can send you all the text.
So it makes more sense that they would name this planet Nibiru, and it's their mystical star that the gods come from.
Sure, that sounds great in theory, but that's not reality.
No. Just
No,
saying.
the gods have always just been a part of Earth.
I'm just saying that if we go on to his theories and Nibiru quote unquote exists, which is does not, you're right, that could be one of the stars that they're referencing too. But is Nibiru ever mentioned in cuneiform tablets?
Nibiru is a word that means crossroads.
Yes, I looked that up too. And then we just took this name out of our ass.
Pretty much.
Okay.
I wondered if he's misinterpreting Nibru, which is a word for Nippur, the city name. Because there's a bunch of texts about these Anunnaki gods like Enki who go to Nibru, which is the city Nippur. And it's essentially a story about the god traveling from his city to that city, which is a reference to the statue of the divine leaving the city and traveling around, which we know they did.
That makes a lot more sense.
So that was where I was wondering if he was getting it from, but I can't be certain because it's kind of up there and he doesn't really say.
Yeah, well, it would definitely make sense because you said, what was the name? Nibiru. Biru. It could definitely be just a mistranslation.
Because even this idea that the gods come from the heavens, that's not really true. Like, some gods live in the heavens, but not all of them. Most of them live on Earth. Some of them are in the heavens sometimes. Some they travel around. Gods move just as much as people do.
Fair.
So it's kind of... And we've talked about why mythical things fly and live in the sky in our previous podcast episode.
Yeah, so if you want to hear that, go listen to
I think that's the paranormal episode.
Is it the paranormal?
Yeah, because we were talking about dragons.
Yes, we were. Same concept, different thing. Go listen to those 2 episodes. Our paranormal activities and our ancient apocalypse. Great episodes. So, Next on my list, and we actually talked a little bit about this before we came up to record, the enlarged skulls that they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to give you what my thoughts and interpretation is on it, and then you give me yours. So they're showing these enlarged skulls and saying, I think it was about how they crossbred with humans.
Yep.
So in a lot of cultures, people did types of things like that for cosmetic reasons.
Skull binding.
Yeah. Or it's just a birth deformity. Because, it's tight coming out of there. You're going to get a little deformed, okay? You ever seen a newborn baby? They do not look like the cute, squishy, huggable things. They kind of look like they're aliens. But an example of this, which is still performed today, is the Kayan tribe from Myanmar, Burma. They put rings around their necks to elongate their necks, and then they add rings over time, and then their body adapts, and they have obviously very long necks. So like for cosmetic purposes or just a deformity.
No evidence of that in Mesopotamia.
For cosmetics.
No. It's possible that they performed it in Egypt, but it wasn't common. It's a stylistic feature of the art. In Mesopotamia, there's none of that.
Okay. And, well, if we touch back on something you had said earlier with people traveling all over the place, is this person even from Sumer? Or could it just be someone who was traveling and died there?
Yeah. So what we're talking about is they show a skull from the Royal Cemetery of Ur, which is excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s. They say 1927. His book starts 1926 to 1930, so ish area. And he discovered this series of graves. There's hundreds of graves, various periods. The ones they're talking about are the royal ones from the early dynastic period, which is the Sumerian period. And they're focusing on this skull of a queen named Puabi. And I have an image on my computer for Bailey to look at to refresh her memory. This is what they showed. There's this very beautiful screenshot, and they highlight the head.
Yeah.
And they say, look at the weird shape. So I actually brought the Ur excavations written by Sir Leonard Woolley because I'm a little extra. So this is grave PG 800. And he calls her Shub-Ad because they did not have the proper translation. So it's changed now how we translate the name. But I marked off this little tiny section where he actually talks about her bones. So he writes, inside the chamber a wooden briar stood somewhat askew across the northwest end. On it lay the body of Queen Shub-Ad, or Puabi. She lay quite straight on her back, her head to the west, her hands crossed over her stomach. A woman attendant was crouched by the side near the head, and a second at the foot. That's all he says about.
Oh, so there's no mention of any
Weird skulls. No, but then he does mention skulls a little bit. So he explains that his wife makes caster plastid, reconstructions so that they can hang the jewelry on. And you can see these at the Penn and the British Museum. We saw some of them, actually. So he writes when his wife is modeling this woman's skull that she needed to actually use one from a different site because the skull of this queen, Puabi, was too damaged in a condition to be used, and therefore somewhat of an older skull of the same type was employed. So what they don't describe about Ur is that these tombs are under enough dirt that it would be the height of your house.
Dear Lord.
So if you imagine a skull under that much dirt, it's going to be flattened.
It's going to get crushed and
So
deformed.
the reason it's a weird shape is because it's broken.
Ah, yeah, again, makes tons of more sense.
It gets even better. So the one that they're showing and insisting is Puabi's skull is, I have next to it the colored version of the same image for Bailey to look at here. This is the skull they're showing. This is from the Great Death Pit, which is a completely different tomb, a completely different person. So here's an image I have for Bailey of the actual queen from the excavation, and you can see she's even more flattened, and her skull is very much scalar shaped.
History Channel, what are you doing with this money? I would like to have some. Can you not present at least one fact that is accurate for your time period?
And if you want to see that image, it is a part of the archives at the Pennsylvania Museum available online. They also reference these cylindrical cone-shaped hats. These are common crowns for gods. So gods always, most definitely, especially these higher up gods, have cones with 6 horns. That's all it is. It's like a cone hat. It has nothing to do with the skull.
Like a dunce cap.
Yeah, so that's that.
Oh, so something I didn't like that they were doing was they were taking many different religions and trying to use it to prove their own theories.
Yep.
Which is a common theme, but at the same time, if you had the proof to support it, you could support it without using other religions.
Mm-hmm.
And in my opinion, religions are very similar. Like the flood myths you can find in almost every religion, the creation story, we were all created from something, and it's, yeah, I don't like how they did that. Like, if you're going to present theories, present your theories, but don't go and be like, oh, well, in Christianity over here, and then in India over here, and then like, oh, this all backs up our thing, right? It's like, no, obviously they also have it, so what makes yours different?
Mm-hmm.
For me, you know. And my next note was the flood myth. Go back to Ancient Apocalypse. Listen to that. We talk about the flood myth and why flood myths are presented in almost every...
On that note, I have a point here, and I'll show you, Bailey, these images later, because it's just going to take too long to do it now. The pictures they show while talking about the flood myth were kind of interesting. They are all pictures from Neo-Assyrian palaces, again, 2,000 years later. And one of them is a warfare picture, another one is a collection of wood, and I don't know what those have to do with the flood, but those were the ones that were chosen.
Interesting choices.
Yeah.
So my final note for my notes were just all of the people they had presenting and giving these quote unquote facts. Most of them were authors. There were only 2 that had PhDs. One was Mary J. Evans. She had a PhD, and she had taught for, I think it was over 30 years, was environmental geography.
Yeah.
And she was a personal friend of Zachariah Stitchin.
It's pretty culty.
Yeah. Other than that one book I think she published, she wrote a lot of horse books. Lot of children's horse books. That was her credibility on the thing. Robert Mullen was the other one. And he's in the Biblical Archaeology Society. He studied at the Hebrew University. That was what he studied, was basically the biblical.
There's a lot of crossover, so I'll give him as credible as they could probably get.
And I'm pretty sure he was given a pretty penny just to talk.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So
when I'm ready to sell out, this is what I'm going to do.
So, yeah, that was his credentials.
Yeah,
But
better than I thought.
yeah, but still not
Not an expert.
an expert on Mesopotamia as a whole,
Yeah.
you know, or just in general with Mesopotamian times, you know. So yeah, that's all my notes. That's all the questions I had for you.
Cool. You covered a lot of the main things I was going to point out.
I was going to say, with how you came at me with the information, I was like, I got it. I got the facts that she wanted.
I don't like that you can read my mind, but I'm going to share my final thoughts and then a few other little inconsistencies that I noticed. I know we're probably going pretty far over time. So final thoughts. There are hardly any images from Sumerian art displayed throughout the episode. Maybe like 2 in 43 minutes.
Wow.
Everything was mostly Neo-Assyrian art. And tablets. Neo-Assyrian tablets. They never mention the text that Sitchin refers to. They only use a few points of evidence with little to no context of their actual evidence. Their information of the facts is spotty at best. Tablets are usually the right way up, but are occasionally displayed sideways for some reason. And their evidence is not great, which we talked about. So this tablet thing really, really pisses me off. And Bailey knows all about this because my students are sometimes guilty of this too. I mentioned the library earlier. One of their old publications had the tablet I was working on sideways. It happens a lot, but they do it inconsistently throughout the episode. I was really impressed at first because there's a 5-second clip of a reconstruction of someone writing in cuneiform and they're doing it the right way.
Wow, the one thing they got right.
Even Wonder Woman does it wrong. So I was like, hey, kudos. And then like 10 minutes later, the tablets are all shown sideways. So that was fun. That gave me a good laugh. I was like, yeah, okay, let's go to the top of my notes and see what we've covered. Most of their facts are just odd, the things they point out and the things they disclude. We talk a lot about finding this library full of ancient knowledge and all these thousands of texts, which is real, but it's an Assyrian library.
Again,
He does collect texts from previous periods. We have a lot of them from him because Ashurbanipal sends out people to write out what they see in inscriptions. So not the worst piece of evidence they could throw at it. But again, they're talking about palaces from the Neo-Assyrian period, the first millennium, and they talk about the sacking of ore from the Elamites, but they're showing pictures from Assyrian palaces, which is in the city of Ashur. So it's a little odd.
yeah.
And I don't know why they brought that up. They also pronounce cuneiform kind of interestingly. And my favorite is Enuma Elish, or as they say, Enuma Elish. And they really pronounce the E. Enuma Elish. I found a couple dissertation figures that I didn't already have in my database, which was a little upsetting. Okay, so talking about Enuma Elish, this is probably my last inconsistency. I also have Myths from Mesopotamia by Stephanie Dolly, which everyone should go read. And in Enuma Elish, so they're talking about the creation of man, and they say Marduk creates humans using blood and mud, but I actually just wrote a conference presentation on this that I gave in the Netherlands, and in fact, this is one of the only creation stories that doesn't use mud to make humans. So that was kind of funny. I think they're misquoting another story, which is called Atrahasis, which is the Akkadian flood story, where they do use mud. And in that story, the Anunnaki create humans because the lower class of gods are whining too much that they have to work and tend to the fields. There's nothing about mines or gold. So I don't know where they're getting that from. So that was kind of fun. I'm just going to double check to make sure we covered everything. They throw the Bible at it a lot to try to make it relevant. The way Assyriology, which is what I study, and Sumeriology comes about is from biblical studies. It also started with a quest to find these biblical sites. So the fact that they keep referencing it isn't unusual, but it is something we've tried really hard to distinguish ourselves from. It was kind of annoying. I was like, just forget it. It doesn't contribute anything to their stories. We talked about the skulls. That one was funny. I had a good laugh at that. Interbreeding with humans, that's hysterical.
I mean, give me night vision or something.
They also love to throw the flood at things. I was surprised there was only one ancient astronaut theorist say yes. Because, they conveniently say yes to the things you need them to say yes to. Oh, the other big one. They're showing images of the Anunnaki. But they are not the Anunnaki they're showing images of. So these winged figures are just winged genies. These, again, come from these Assyrian palaces from the first millennium. And as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen many attested before the first millennium. They might be a little bit of Egyptian or Mitanni influence in there. And they're protective figures. I have some theories. I'm not going to share them because people will steal ideas sometimes, and I would like to publish on this idea. Eventually, one day, maybe I'll talk about it. But, yeah, no. If you're going to show the Anunnaki, show pictures of Enki or Enlil. Come on.
Yeah, if you're using him as your backbone basis kind of thing.
Exactly. And then, Noah built a spaceship to avoid the flood on an actual boat. That was funny. And then they brought up Mars, and I was like, okay, I'm gone.
Of course.
And it's like, the last maybe 5 minutes, they start throwing all this really craziness at you. So they try to bury these ideas in fact that is incorrect. But it's believable. And it is somewhat like, okay, we're talking about the cemetery of Ur, at least they're in the same site. And, they're showing these pictures which are real, and they're talking about these facts that are real sometimes. And then they throw in, they had their way station on Mars at the end. And I was just kind of, this is a weird way to conclude your story. Like, why? It would be almost more believable if you left that stuff out.
Yeah, I was going to say, so as I was watching this episode, I watched it all the way through, and they had started talking about Mars. So I went to go grab a coffee, and then by the time I got back, it started talking about something else. And I was like, what happened? But it ended the episode. And I was like, are we done? Is that it? Yeah, it made it end very abruptly, and it didn't tie in at all.
When they were talking about Ur, they were showing pictures from various sites, again, different time periods, which is really funny. Some of the tablets they're showing are actually Sumerian. Some of them are definitely not. There's one particular piece that I have here for Bailey to see a screenshot of, which is an alien face, is one of the actually only pieces of Sumerian art they showed, which is kind of funny. And it's a figure of a woman and probably the deity Inanna from Uruk. Not. So, fact check. All I did for a lot of these images to find out where they got them from, if I didn't recognize them, was I put them through a Google image search and voila. And often it would bring me to the museum website. So there are ways to do this.
Yeah. And for any of my information on the people with the PhDs or anything like that, I image search them.
Yeah.
And it would tell me what, their PhDs in and everything like that. So even for people who you think are credible, check. Because they are certainly credible, but not in the area that they're attesting to be credible.
And you can check my credentials, as they are on the U of T website, and academia, and LinkedIn, and Facebook. I have a publication, and it's a very, very minor one from a conference, but I do present at conferences. So go ahead, check.
Exactly. Always double check your facts, especially when it comes to these shows.
And then find Bailey while you're at it.
You won't ever be able to find me. I am incognito. But you know what? We're going to wrap this up for today. Drop us a comment. Look in the very near future for our YouTube channel, which will go under the Whole Shebang on YouTube. Cheers, guys.
That's all for today. Catch us on Instagram, where we drop teasers for the next show, and our Discord account. Links are down below.